Hello YouTube, this is Morgan Airspeed Prime here with my next Star Wars video. Here is the promised video I said I would do, where I would cover my favorite Star Wars books. So I have a top 5 list here, and I'm also going to mention some quick honorable mentions at the start. But yeah, just know that this list isn't just novels, it is kind of all books in general. But for the most part I do stick to novels. There's not really that many other books that I mention. So, yeah, I'm not going to spend like a ton of time talking about every single book, but enough to where if you're not aware of that book, hopefully I will have made you a little bit more interested in said book. But, yeah, so final things are just that, like, note that I haven't read every single Star Wars book. I doubt there are many fans out there who have, in that I tend to, for the most part, stick to like prequel era stuff and kind of before that. So I haven't really read a lot, if any, of the books that are kind of the legend stuff that relates to the original trilogy. I haven't read many of those books at all. So let's jump in here with some quick honorable mentions. I'm not really going to talk about these that much, just going to kind of quickly go through some of the names here. The Force Unleashed 1 and 2, both of those books, while I get a lot of people don't like The Force Unleashed, and it's kind of very much non-canon, completely, especially now, but I still think they're well-written books, and I can kind of get behind the main character and what they do, and as kind of like an alternate version of kind of how the rebellion starts and what they do here. I think they're actually very, very well told, in that even if you're not a fan of the games, I think the books are kind of worth checking out for extra detail on the story. So that's that. Dark Rendezvous, this is one of the Clone Wars books about Yoda. One is a Yoda-focused book, which there aren't really too many of. It focuses a decent amount on his relationship with Dooku, as kind of a meeting is sort of set up between the two of them. There's some really great scenes in here with Yoda and Dooku, as well as some references to their past, because they are Master and Apprentice. So that's a very, very good book. Next to Star Wars Clone Wars Wild Space and Clone Wars No Prisoners. These are two kind of follow-ups to each other. Again, I think they're both just really good kind of Clone Wars stories. These are some of the first two books that involve Ahsoka in them as a novel character. And I think they're very well done. Especially Wild Space has a really cool kind of plot with Obi-Wan, and who goes to like a Sith kind of planet and how he's affected by that. And I think Bail Organa's involved in that. So both of those books are very well done. And then as one of the more kind of recent books, Thrawn from the kind of new canon stuff, I think is actually a very, very good book if you want to know more about the character. But yeah, from there, let's jump into the actual list. My number 5 pick is actually the one I had the most trouble with choosing for the list, in that I really would say you could probably interchange my number 5 pick with any of the honorable mentions I mentioned just before this. That's how kind of close it is. I went for this one over the others because when I really think about these books, something just kind of stands out to me with this one. Like, I feel a little bit more strongly about this one, but I overall would rate it very closely to the others, and perhaps, you know, it is kind of a top 4, and then my number 5 pick on the list is a little bit below the other 4. And I suppose this is where a lot of books are kind of coming into play here for a spot on the list. That's how I think close a lot of Star Wars books are to just about making the list. But the one I settled with is Star Wars Dark Disciple by Christie Golden, which I believe is the only canon Star Wars book, current canon book that I have here. And what I like about this book so much, obviously this book is the kind of Quinlan Vos, Asajj Ventress kind of team-up book, but it's also meant to basically act as, here is the canonization of a lot of Quinlan Vos's Legends stuff in regards to him being like a Dark Jedi. And it was meant to, of course, be a Clone Wars arc. And after reading this book, I'm like, this would have been an amazing Clone Wars arc. Now, I think the little bits and pieces we know kind of suggest that it probably wouldn't have been maybe as intense as the book ends up being, which I think means that the book ends up being a better way to showcase what actually happens here, in that I don't think a lot of the intensity of the way they go with the character development perhaps would have been able to have been shown as much in the Clone Wars. That said, towards the end of the Clone Wars, they were getting into some pretty kind of heavy stuff. So I feel that this could have been an amazing arc if we had got here, because this is getting towards the end of the war, and you can tell that that's what's happening here. The Jedi are starting to make some big moves, and that's what's so good about this book, is that it's not just a strong character book for Ventress and also Quinlan Vos. It's also just a really interesting book to see how, like, the Jedi Council react to a lot of this stuff. How they react to kind of Quinlan Vos's kind of the decisions he's making with regards to the plan he's kind of sent out on, which is kind of, they make the decision that they need to basically execute Count Dooku, which goes against everything they sort of stand for, but they know it's something that they have to do to end the war, and so they kind of send Quinlan Vos out as the Jedi who should best execute this kind of dark mission. And he ends up having to team up with Ventress to be powerful enough to defeat Dooku, which is where he kind of goes down the path of, almost falling to the dark side. And one of the big things, without spoiling too much, is that they begin to set up a romance between Ventress and Quinlan Vos, which is, I think, a very well done romance. It's different than I think any of the other romances I've really seen in Star Wars, but it works really well because Ventress, over the course of like the Clone Wars and some of the other books she appears in, is a really, really fascinating character, especially with some of the bigger decisions they made in the later seasons of Clone Wars. And this acts as, I suppose, her kind of final appearance, basically, without spoiling too much. And just how they go about doing that, I think it's a fitting kind of conclusion for this character, and it acts as a very good, like, I feel like I really, really know Quinlan Vos as a character now. His episode in the Clone Wars I thought was quite good, but he just kind of felt like another Jedi to a degree, even though he was somewhat special. This felt like if they had managed to get something across like this book in the Clone Wars show, you would have had another kind of standout character on your hands. As it is, that character is really going to remain only known to readers of the books, which is kind of really weird to think about, because that's exactly what Quinlan Vos was before he even appeared in the Clone Wars show. When it was just his Legends stuff, he was seen as, I suppose, one of the more popular Legends-only characters for the most part. And I suppose part of the intent here was to actually bring that interesting character out to a wider audience, but then it was cancelled, and he ends up basically being the same thing again, just in the new continuity, where only if you've read this book do you actually know how interesting of a character Quinlan Vos actually is. But it's very well done. You get a lot of characterization for Dooku as he gets involved, and it's I was constantly impressed with this. I listened to this one in the audiobook, which was also very well done, and I was just kind of thinking, like, oh, why are they going to end it here? No, they're going on. Loads of twists, and I think I was just so invested in this book. That's, I think, the big thing that made me choose this above the other ones on the list. Is just, it's intense, and how the author writes, like, the emotion of these characters. You really feel this book, and I think that's why it stands out as, to me, one of the best books from the new batch of books. Not to say there's no good books, but I think this one, for me, probably is the best one I've read so far in terms of being invested. But yeah, that has been my number 5 pick, Dark Disciple. My number 4 pick is 2 books, and they are The Jedi Path and also The Book of Sith. Both of which are, as you can tell, reference books, basically, but kind of made out as in-universe reference books, and they're very much presented that way, where it is each page is basically written by someone from within the Star Wars universe, and then there are actually, in both books, writings by different other characters written in the kind of margins, commenting on obviously in the Jedi Path on the Jedi kind of philosophy, and then in the Sith commenting on the Sith philosophy. And I think both books together are this excellent insight, I suppose, into this key conflict in Star Wars of Jedi versus Sith, that explaining their different philosophies on the Force, going through, I suppose, a couple of the key members of each kind of faction and what they represent. With the Jedi, path, it also actually serves this good idea of showing you, I suppose, how ritualistic they kind of tend to be in terms of like, oh yeah, it actually kind of is sort of a religion because of the way they kind of focus on some things. But it's very similar with the Sith in that they're, yes, it's a bit more arcane and about magic and in some of the early sections, and then like with the Night Sisters and so on. But you see the different, I suppose, eras of the Sith, when there were this army versus when it was Bane, versus how different it is in modern time with like Palpatine and Plagueis and their kind of approach to things. I think together they really work well. If you are super into the battle between the Jedi and the Sith, together these books are just amazing kind of repository of information of just like, you ever want to know about like lightsaber forms, the Jedi Path is actually a really good way of kind of showing that, because it has a page on each of the 7 lightsaber forms, and you have other characters comment on it and kind of give these little insights into it. You know, like you have Obi-Wan, Luke, I think Yoda, Ahsoka commenting in the Jedi Path book. You have in the Sith book, you also I think have Yoda. You have Mace Windu at times. I think Palpatine is done throughout both of them as well. Occasionally Vader in the Book of Sith is done. Anakin, I think, in the Jedi Path. So you get all these different kind of perspectives, and especially on the few occasions when you maybe get multiple characters kind of having almost like a conversation with each other between eras about kind of things. You see like Ahsoka having a comment to something Anakin said, which is about like this like ancient Jedi text, and there's some really fun stuff that like fits in character wise as well. And I just think these books are excellent, and it's something like, as I suppose primarily an Avatar fan in terms of what I do on my YouTube channel, I'd love Avatar to release something like this for any kind of faction within the Avatar world, to learn kind of more about the history this way. These are very, very well put together reference books. Even just how they look, the way they kind of do the kind of, I suppose, cutting of the pages, like it looks like they're kind of worn books. Like the Book of Sith is put together with like I think it's 5 separate texts by 5 different Sith lords, and you can tell like each section, like the page is kind of cut differently because it was kind of written on different paper. The Jedi Path book, you can sort of tell it's like aged a bit because not all the pages are sort of the same length and so on. It's really, really well done, I think, on all accounts. And then I think they also have other ones that are like, there's a Bounty Hunter book, there's a Rebels, there's an Imperial book, that just goes in depth on explaining, I suppose, the inner workings of those kind of factions. But for me, it's these two on the Jedi and the Sith that really stand out as being the best, because a huge part of my interest in Star Wars comes from the Jedi versus Sith kind of battle and how it goes throughout the entire history of Star Wars. So definitely these 2 books are well worth getting. The Jedi Path is probably the one I'd say is the overall better book, because I feel because of the nature of how it's kind of put together, it kind of comes across as a little bit more of a overview of the Jedi, whereas the Sith book can at times come across as a little bit too, oh, here's the section on Bane, so we're only focused on this one thing with Bane. Here's the Plagueis section, so it's only focused on like midichlorians. Whereas I feel if they'd almost made the Sith book a little bit more like the Jedi Path, of like maybe not doing it so in-universe perspective, it would have allowed us to maybe get something like a list of all the different Rule of 2 Sith Lords and how that kind of exactly works, and the exact history of what the specifics are, what happened as the Rule of 2 progressed. It's still very, very good. It just it feels like there's still so many stories to be told within the Sith that they're obviously only chose to focus on the Sith Lords we know about, the likes of Malgus, Plagueis, Palpatine, and so on. So yeah, that's my number 4 pick. My number 3 pick is also sort of a cheat, in that it's 3 books, and they are primarily, I suppose, the Revenge of the Sith novelization by Matthew Stover, but also the books that kind of go either end of that. The lead into Revenge of the Sith, which is Labyrinth of Evil by James Luceno, and then the, I suppose, follow-up to Revenge of the Sith, which is Star Wars Dark Lord, The Rise of Darth Vader, also by James Luceno. Obviously, it's a trilogy of books in that it's the movie novelization and the book that leads into it and follows up from it. And I suppose if I had to specify one of them, it would be the Revenge of the Sith novelization. Not that there's any huge particular reason for why I choose it over the other ones. Mainly, I suppose it would be down to nostalgia, in that I would definitely cite the Revenge of the Sith novelization as probably being one of the first, I suppose, bigger books that I kind of read, in terms of primarily I don't even really kind of smaller kind of kids, teenage focused books, and then this is the first, I suppose, full on fantasy kind of big novel that I've read that was 200 plus pages type thing. And it was probably at the height of my excitement for Star Wars, waiting for episode 3 to come out, when I was so into anything, getting any details on what this movie was going to be about. Especially because this book was released prior to the movie actually coming out. So I think I remember getting this book the day it was released and just going through it and realizing this is what the movie's going to be about. This is that kind of legendary confrontation between Anakin and Obi-Wan that I'd heard about for so long, and now here I am reading about it, and it's everything I hoped it would be, and it lived up to my expectations. And thankfully, the movie also did as well. The Revenge of the Sith, I think, is always going to be probably one of my favorites, one of, if not always, my favorite Star Wars movie. And because of that, I think I really would cite Revenge of the Sith, the novel, as kind of getting me into the rest of the Star Wars books. Because after that, I did start to read some of the other ones. And so when Labyrinth of Evil and also Rise of Darth Vader came out, I did read those, and they're both very well done books. I'm not going to talk too much about the specifics of what happens in each of them, but they're James Luceno books. There's a name which of course you'll see on my list kind of a lot, and that I do feel probably James Luceno probably is my favorite Star Wars author. But I think the core of this is that Clone Wars, especially kind of late Clone Wars, getting into Revenge of the Sith, and a little bit of the afterwards, is probably my favorite era of Star Wars. I just love the kind of Clone Wars settings, especially towards the end when I think everyone can sense that there's some really bad stuff going down. They can almost sense something is about to happen. You have your characters at the most developed, especially in Labyrinth of Evil. I love getting to see kind of Obi-Wan and Anakin towards the end of their friendship, when they're the closest of close friends. That's what the book and the Revenge of the Sith movie did so well, of just getting across how close they are as friends, almost brothers. And Labyrinth of Evil obviously gives them a chance just before that to kind of characterize that a bit more, of just kind of where the Clone Wars TV show was getting to up until right towards they kind of cancelled it, just before they were getting into the really late era Clone Wars stuff. I suppose the original Clone Wars animation by Gennady Tartakovsky, the second arc of that, when Anakin's older, which leads directly into it and sort of it overlaps a little bit with Labyrinth of Evil, that kind of era is very well done, and I think Anakin is done a very good justice in a lot of these books. And then the Dark Lord, Rise of Darth Vader, is good because on one hand, obviously it is a huge focus on him adapting to his armor. It's probably the thing on my list that I suppose is the most heavily contradicted by stuff that we've got since then. I haven't read a lot of the recent kind of canon comics, but I think a lot of them have focused on Vader, and I'm pretty sure that they probably do go against, I suppose, some of the portrayal in the Dark Lord book. But I do like what it is as a book. Both Labyrinth of Evil and Dark Lord probably do suffer a little bit from, I suppose, what generally tends to be a little bit of what maybe drags down most of the expanded universe novels, of just occasionally having a side plot away from the main arc of the book, where you're focused on characters who are kind of newly introduced in that book and maybe won't survive the entire book, who are good and you care about them, but it's not as big of an impact when they kind of go away at the end. And I think that's sort of the case to a degree, especially in Dark Lord. Not as much in Labyrinth of Evil, because it's so close to the episode 3 that it has to almost be like an extra part kind of attached to that movie. But all three of these books together, I think, are very, very well done. So that's why they make my number 3 slot, as I suppose my nostalgia spot on the list to a degree. My number 2 pick on my list is a little bit of a cheat, like I've been doing up to now, but it is the Darth Bane trilogy from the Old Republic books. So this is the trio of books, which are, the first one is Darth Bane Path of Destruction, the second one is Darth Bane Rule of Two, and the third one is Darth Bane Dynasty of Evil. If I had to specify one of them, I would choose the first book, because I feel it is the overall most important. Obviously, not to say that book 2 and 3 don't do anything for the trilogy. They do, of course. But they're more focused on Bane's apprentice, Zana, and I suppose continuing the Rule of Two, in that, like, Bane introduces it. How does the first instance of the title being passed on actually go about? So I get why, of course, it's not just left as the first book and ending with the Rule of Two coming into play, but continuing it on, in that they kind of just had to choose a point to end it on. Like, if not, it'll just be forever ongoing of just, here's the entire detailed history of the Sith. But what makes this trilogy so interesting is that, like I've kind of talked about, I think, in a lot of these, it is that it's a book that tells an important story. It's not just a story within the Star Wars universe that maybe happens to be well written, happens to have some decent characters in it. It is an important story, because the core, I suppose, story of Star Wars is the Skywalker saga. It's the initial kind of 6 movies, now kind of moving into being the initial 9 movies, and telling that story. And a key aspect of that story is the Revenge of the Sith plan kind of reaching its fruition, and that is the Sith, I suppose, taking their revenge on the Jedi, eliminating the Jedi, and then, I suppose, falling in the original trilogy. And so we obviously have known, it is canon, that the Rule of Two is a thing, and as much as, of course, it's a Legends book, and you can debate that forever, it tells the story of how that thing that we know exists from the Clone Wars. We know Bane actually exists in the universe. Whether the specifics are the same as the book, we're not sure. The Rule of Two is a thing. How does the Sith change from being this kind of army of darkness that fights the army of light of the Jedi to being just two? Why does it change? How does that change come about, and what is the overall impact on the galaxy? And that's exactly what these books tell the story of. They tell the story of the first book, especially, of how this Cortosis miner called Dessel eventually becomes Darth Bane over time, and his path to becoming a Sith Lord, his training, discovery of his force powers, and so on. Eventually, you know, his study of ancient texts, and realizing that the current Sith are nothing like the past, and they're going nowhere. That what the Sith are currently does not represent what they are. And he's such an interesting character, Bane, in that initially it can come across as if he's just this kind of brutish character who's just like really big and strong, and that's all there is to him. But then, like, they add in these other features of, like, you kind of wouldn't expect of him, of like, no, he researches the ancient Sith before they kind of, you know, changed into this Brotherhood of Darkness that they talk about in this trilogy. Researches the Sith who used to use the Darth title in the past, and why he wants to bring it back, and so on. It's just, I think, one of the few Star Wars books, this trilogy, and like my number 1 pick, which I'll get to, that tells a story that kind of feels like this should be covered at some point in one of the more well-known pieces of media, in that I think a Star Wars movie about Darth Bane, an origin story type movie about that, about the Rule of Two and how it comes into play, absolutely should be a thing that should be done. I think the only fear would be that right now, I don't know if Disney would ever tell a story that focuses on a villain, because fundamentally, like, the books don't really have a hero character as such. There are Jedi characters, there are kind of like Jedi main characters, but they're not nowhere near as strong of a character, and because the focus isn't on them, they can never really come across as strongly in any sort of a movie if they told it. Bane would have to be the main character of the movie, and I don't know if they'd be willing to do that, as interesting as I think it is. That's why I think they really have to try and do something different with a lot of their new projects. Of, like, obviously we know that Rian Johnson is going to be making a trilogy of Star Wars movies. We know the Game of Thrones producers are going to be doing some Star Wars movies. How different are they going to be than the Star Wars, than the Skywalker saga, and so on? I think we need stories like this because this book is so well done, and it speaks to the fact that, like, we always get things from like a Jedi perspective, but we tend to almost overlook the Sith perspective. They just tend to be the villains, and I don't really feel like the Sith themselves have gotten the attention and focus that they kind of deserve within the universe. In that even the Clone Wars, which of course uses a few more kind of dark side, user characters, I'd love to see a focus on that, and just have a movie just exploring a character who is just entrenched in the dark side of the Force and has his reasons, I suppose, for why he follows the dark side of the Force rather than the light. And I suppose the fact that the way Bane manages to do it is that you don't hate him. I think it takes until a good bit into the trilogy for you to kind of really just accept that he's this full-on evil character. You still, I think, by the end, understand where he came from to kind of become this way, of feeling kind of left out by the galaxy and wanting to make a change. So it's one of those books where I, like my number one pick, I'm just going to say, like, it feels like it's almost like a must-read for a Star Wars fan. You have to check out this book, because the Rule of Two, I think, is an important enough thing where, like, you should know what the Rule of Two is, where it comes from. And if they're not going to, like, make the book canon, tell that story in a TV show, tell that story in a movie, or just redo the book, have someone else write more or less the same thing but make it canon. Whatever you want to do. These stories just need to be back. We need to be telling Old Republic stories that expand the universe more and don't just have everything link into the movies. So that's my thoughts on the book. And of course, getting into some of the later stuff. Zana, who is his apprentice, that's more in book 2 and 3 stuff. She's a very interesting character when she comes into play as well. And they managed to I think, do a very nice kind of group of minor characters as well, the different Jedi characters that are involved, and other characters, to just connect all the books together, as well as, I suppose, starting some of the, like, more Rule of Two political machinations things. And I think just what makes the first book especially so important is just how he executes his plan to basically eliminate most of the Sith himself to get the Rule of Two into play is so impressive. And I think I'd highlight the first book over the other two just because I think the cast of characters in the first book is so well done, even more so than the other ones. But that is my number 2 pick. So my number 1 pick, last but not least, is Darth Plagueis. To me, this was the first one I had on the list. It was the most obvious choice. There was really nothing at all that came close to this in terms of being number 1 on the list. Quite simply, this is the best written, it is the best Star Wars novel, and I don't think anything really comes close for me. I think Darth Bane is the closest, but I do think Plagueis is a much better written book. It's I I think has a wider appeal just because it does link directly into the prequels and sets up that stuff, and just in general kind of feels like a kind of more important story to a degree. And just I think how it goes about telling its story, because it's both the initial introduction and also kind of basically complete life of Darth Plagueis, but also the origin story for Palpatine. It hits these two kind of points that are just, to me, unmatched by any of the other books in terms of like, oh, this book is about this book's about that. No, this book covers these two things, and those two things alone make it worthwhile, while also covering a lot of other stuff. Because a huge point that I give this book as a positive is also that it really effectively covers a lot of ground with regards to just the details surrounding the prequel trilogy, with regards to, like, say, for instance, you heard about Cloak of Deception as the book that sets up episode 1, well, you didn't really want to read it. I think this book does a good enough job that, like, it gives you the basics of kind of what happens in the lead into episode 1, without going as in depth as Cloak of Deception does. Similarly with just a lot of kind of that sort of stuff, it covers a lot of that political ground to just set up the politics of episode 1 very nicely, because I think when it comes to the Sith training, they do a great job at kind of continuing on sort of what Bane set up, of a huge part of the Sith with the Rule of Two is going to be how they use kind of political power from the shadows by maintaining a kind of alter ego. Like Darth Plagueis is different than Higo Damask, which is his actual name, in the same way that Palpatine is different than Sidious. That one is, you know, the Supreme Chancellor, the Senator of Naboo, whatever title he has. The other is the Dark Lord of the Sith. The same with Higo Damask. He's a member of the banking clan and has, you know, powers and, you know, wealth because of that, and influence in the galaxy, in the same way that kind of Palpatine does politically. And you see them come together with some of the lessons that Plagueis gives Palpatine, explaining how this is how the Revenge of the Sith plan is acted out in the modern age. We do it through, you know, politics and influencing people, manipulation, not through a giant army of dark side users that can easily be taken out by the Jedi or whoever. That long gone are those days. There's a benefit to only having two people in the shadows manipulating everything. And as well as that, because he kind of goes into the explanation of the big plan, he also explains, like, basically the history of the Rule of Two. That, you know, okay, we know how it started with Bane, and you can read those books to find out how it started. But, like, what happens between then and now? What happens between the start and the end of the plan? What were the key moves with regards to the plan actually reaching fruition? And I think that's what Plagueis does very nicely in terms of explaining some of the key events that have happened over the different Dark Lords of the Sith, as the title has been passed from person to person, of like, oh, here is an era where the plan nearly fell apart because, you know, there was an issue with this Dark Lord and so on. Here is one of the best Dark Lords who made one of the biggest moves with regards to helping the plan going forward. And obviously, this is what we're going to do going forward, and we know what happens, of course, with the movies. That's why this book is so interesting, because it's not just Plagueis and Palpatine and just the initial, the current two members of the Rule of Two. It's also filling in the gaps about what happened before, the subtleties and the details. You do learn, of course, about like Plagueis' master, Tenebrous, and so on, as well as obviously seeing some of the Palpatine stuff kind of coming to fruition with, like, here's how Maul comes into play, here's like Dooku and the kind of start of the whole Kamino cloning plan coming into fruition. And that's what that's how it works so nicely, because you know from like Attack of the Clones that there's a lot of stuff that kind of happens behind the scenes to get to the point where like the Clone Wars can happen, and here is some of those kind of bigger plans coming into play. And if there's any weakness you could level at Plagueis, it's perhaps that it's not a particularly action focused book. There are fight scenes, of course, and you get this sort of stuff of like force powers, lightsaber training, because it's a book about two Sith Lords and the training of one of them, but it's not like to the point of like, say, one of the bigger lightsaber scenes in Darth Bane or anything like that. It is more about just a general overview of these key events that like lead Plagueis to meeting Palpatine, and then where they go as master and apprentice. It's very, very well done. The other side of that is that each Sith Lord, of course, always tends to have a kind of speciality. So Palpatine's, of course, is politics, but Plagueis is revealed to be kind of the science of midichlorians, and this is a huge, huge part of the book about I suppose, explaining the whole Darth Plagueis the Wise and the story that is told in episode 3 of like the person who could stop the people he cares about from dying, and that's exactly what Plagueis is researching throughout all of this book. And we get great detail into what midichlorians are, in that I think a lot of people who criticize midichlorians fundamentally don't get what they are, and it's not I think because episode 1 does a bad job at explaining it. I think it's just that people didn't accept the explanation and so didn't take on board what it meant, whereas I suppose Plagueis has much more time to explain the concept better and the details of what actually it is. The limitations to like that as a thing actually has, because of the crazy research and experimentation that he starts to do, but also what he is able to manipulate by understanding what midichlorians are. I won't go into the details of spoiling what happens, but just it is a huge part of what the book is, and you kind of see, I suppose, the differences between everyone of like, this Sith takes this approach, their apprentice doesn't really agree with that, and they take a different approach. And so while overall the Rule of Two makes each Sith Lord more powerful than the last, to a degree some element of like the previous Sith Lord is kind of lost, because you kind of lose that speciality on one subject and you don't really have it as much, and that it's really clear by the end of the book that Palpatine knew some of what Plagueis was researching, but not everything. And so that kind of explains the episode 3 thing of like, I don't have the power, but together we can try and make it a reality of being able to bring people back in that way and save people from death. So amazing book. There's not enough praise I can give to it. It just far and away is the best Star Wars book we've gotten so far. To me, there's no question, and there's no real rival to this book. It just flat out is the best Star Wars book that's out there. But yeah, that's my thoughts. That's my top 5 list. In the comments, let me know what your thoughts are. What are your top 5 favorite Star Wars books? And also let me know if you want me to go more in depth on any of these books. If you'd like to see me do like a full kind of spoiler review that goes through like the key kind of spoiler details from some of these books or not. But yeah, I'll probably be doing kind of other reviews like this for other books as they come out, and just to keep this a somewhat occasional thing that I do on my channel. But yeah, that's been the video. Thanks for watching, and bye.